Hi, so another year done, and it's time to review the goings on in World of Warcraft for 2018. So 2018 was one of these lead-in years. These sort of alternate, don't they? The start of 2018, Legion was sort of done. Yes, there were still people doing the content, finishing things off. But all the content that was going to be coming out for Legion specifically had already come out. All that was left to come out was the pre-expansion stuff for BFA, which included a little bit of tidying up of the Legion story and BFA itself. So we started off in January. There was a Q&A later on there, which had a few useful snippets of information. But mostly what it was to announce the pre-order. They set a release date of, well, not the release date, but a maximum release date of 21st of September 2018 for BFA. The reason being largely believed so that they could sell the pre-orders there and then. In order to sell pre-orders, you have to sort of say, well, it's definitely going to be out by this date, and generate a load of income because people would buy it, not so much for the collector's edition and other bonuses, although some may have done it for that, but because they released the allied races, the first 4 allied races. And Void Elves were all the rage. Of course, that was for Alliance players. But there were a few little things in Hazakostas also said about BFA. The only time you'll ever get them to frankly acknowledge any failings in an expansion are when that expansion is done and they're hyping the next one. They're going to explain what they're going to improve. And one thing that I particularly latched onto was the notion that although class fantasy was a phrase that had been used a lot during Legion, it hadn't really been class fantasy so much as spec fantasy. There was an acknowledgement that there was too much, too many abilities that were spec specific when really they should have been associated with the whole class, and it was more spec fantasy than class fantasy, and that they would be addressing that. They said that utility abilities would become class-wide, not spec-specific, with the exception of powerful healing abilities. Going into February, this is when the alpha was released to the public. I say the public, obviously it was still by invitation only. But what initially happened was classes were losing all their artifact abilities, of course, but not really gaining any to compensate. There was no redesign of the classes planned, with the exception of a few specs that Blizzard had already said were not really where they wanted it to be in Legion. Which was a bit disconcerting because a lot of people would say, no, actually, when you take these away, what you have underneath is not a perfectly good class. The way Blizzard has approached it is they thought they'd designed a perfectly good class, and then what they'd put on top of it with the artifact abilities was like turning us into some sort of superhero type thing. But in actual fact, everything works just fine without it, which was not at all the case. They did sort of fairly quickly acknowledge that and change tack. There was also significant changes in the way abilities were coded. And this gave rise initially to the feeling that, oh, great, what this will mean is, because when we start getting weapons again, because, in Legion, we hadn't needed to acquire weapons. We had our artifact. We had relics, which bunged on the item level for it, but you needed 3 relics to do that. So you had a little bit of protection against extremes there, especially with Titan forging. So there was a fear now that with weapons for a lot of classes, not all, but a lot of classes are disproportionately useful in terms of the power they give to certain classes compared to other pieces of equipment. And with Titan forging as well, that you could end up with huge outliers here. So they sort of suggested that, first of all, they wouldn't Titan forge, but also we could see in the way abilities were being coded that there was a strong suggestion that the weapons wouldn't be as strong as compared to in the past, which is, although, over time it was better understood and views of that refined, it nonetheless turned out to be the case that although weapons could still be the single most important piece of equipment for a character, for a class, not the be-all and end-all that it was a few years ago. Blizzard also introduced their new MVP program as part of the shake-up of the forums, which is sort of culminating what we've got now. Now, an awful lot of people took that to be a sort of attempt to sanitize it, because these MVPs were not really going to be people who are going to be most useful on the forums so much as the ones who would toe the party line and keep, as I say, the forums in a very sanitized state, and therefore even more useless. I mean, this is the problem. You've got a company with, you know, its own forums. Those should be where the most exciting discussions are taking place. But in actual fact, if you want to find real discussions in the community, the last place you go is to the official forums. In March, Legion finally came to an end officially, because Antorus could be done cross-realm on Mythic mode. That is pretty much saying that's that tier done, even though some people are still progressing, of course. But once they do that, that's them saying that basically the tier's done, and that's, you know, because the raid carries the heavyweight storyline arc of an expansion. Once the final raid is done, the final expansion is done, or at least that expansion is done. It's not the final expansion. The final story of the expansion is done. Class design took a more positive turn. This is where all of a sudden woke up one day and there was an update and there were a load of redesigns. I was playing Ret Paladin, of course, and huge redesign to the class, which was so magnificent that I was compelled to order a box of like cookies, muffins and all sorts of goodies and sent it off to Blizzard HQ with specific instructions that it was to go to the person who'd done the ret changes. And although it sort of did get to that person, but I gathered later they didn't really see much of it because everyone else ate it before while their back was turned. But never mind. So there was a great deal of hope there that they've acknowledged now that the original plan for class design BFA was not going to be enough. So, you know, they're now waking up to it nice and early in the alpha as well. So it gave them time to do it. So it was all looking very positive at this point. Another bit of major news really in March was the news that First Aid would be disappearing. The products of First Aid would not. You know, so bandages now made by tailors and other bits and pieces by alchemists. But the First Aid profession itself was seen as no longer being relevant. So that was going to make way there. Going into April, we had the BFA release date announced. Just as with Legion, they gave us basically 4 months notice, which, you know, remember, for most expansions, they gave you 2 months notice. Basically, they gave you as much notice as they had to, because obviously it takes a couple of months to sort out all the logistics, you know, get all the, especially when it wasn't digital downloads, get all the physical copies into the stores and all the rest of it. Because you always felt in the past that they released it. This is the thing with Blizzard, of course. They released the game when it was ready, which means you didn't get that much notice of when it was coming out. Whereas here they are giving you 4 months notice. At the time they gave us the notice, it was not even close to being ready. So they put themselves on a very tight schedule. Now, I've no doubt that it's not the idea of the developers to give this sort of notice. But they then commit themselves to a certain date. And if they're not ready, they can't exactly just put it back. But that's the way it's been done now for 2 expansions. So maybe that is the way it's going to be done. We've got a bit of a glimpse of old ear testing. And the new PvP talents as well came into there. And this is where I started to feel that given that Legion had totally out of the blue completely wrecked the Burning Legion as a threat to us, it eliminated it completely. We didn't just battle the Legion, we defeated it. When I had a look at what Uldir was about, it was very much about a facility, of course, to kill or to discover how to kill old gods without harming Azeroth. At that point you start to think, oh yeah, this is an expansion where we've seen the end of the Burning Legion as a threat. Now we're going to see the end of old gods on Azeroth as a threat. The game is going somewhere, that the storyline is going somewhere new. So this was, you know, for me, one of the most exciting parts of the year. Because although, you know, here we are now, we even know a little bit about what's coming out in 8.2, I'm still convinced that's the story. Other things we got to see, we got a bit to see the Dark Iron Dwarf, which is of course out now, as well as the Magar Orc. The racials weren't out yet, but we could sort of play about with them, have a look at them. The Dark Iron Dwarf in particular, if I'd have stayed as Alliance, I definitely would have had a Dark Iron Dwarf something. I wouldn't have changed my main into it, but I may well have had a Dark Iron Dwarf warrior, for example. Absolutely fantastic, one of the best racial models that they've brought out for a while. If not the best. I love the Fiery Beard and all the rest of it. It's absolutely magnificent. Going into May, we had Threatgate. This is where they announced massive nerfs to threat generation for tanks, and everyone was losing their minds. And I sort of looked at the figures, did a video, and said, look, you're not really going to notice any difference. It's out now. Everyone's tried the old threat figures. They've been in place for a while now. Has it made a big difference? I didn't notice any difference, as I suspected. You let me know if you saw a difference, or if you think you've got tanks that can't hold threat, because I don't see it at all. I behave in the same way as I used to. I don't really have to behave myself, even on a pull. There you go. In June, we had the Three Sisters comics. So then they're starting to build up, flesh out characters and storylines for BFA. Because of the nature of the Three Sisters comics and the Warbringers that came after it, it did seem to be quite personality driven. They were sort of exploring or re-exploring relationships between certain characters, sometimes retconning them, sometimes just adding in detail where it didn't exist before. And for some reason, as a result of this comic, everyone sort of became convinced that Sylvanas was like the enemy of the old gods, and the old gods were scared crapless of her. And no, absolute nonsense. Absolute nonsense. She's doing exactly what they want her to do. But I explained all that at the time. Blizzard also had Classic WoW news. So they'd announced Classic WoW the previous, November at BlizzCon 2017. And then said nothing for months and months and months. So here we are, just over half a year later, and they've finally announced that it's going to be based around patch 1.12, which was important to know because there was an awful lot of, well, where's it going to start? Is it going to start at the beginning and you move through the patches we did then? That's really weird, because then if you don't start playing it as soon as it comes out, you come halfway in, it's all very strange. So it seems like rather than a dynamic server, it's going to be a fixed server of 1.12, although there is going to be some dynamism. We found this out later on, in that they're not going to have all of the content available at the time. It's just the game is based on that patch, but the content will still be brought out over time. There was an interview that came out where Ian Hazacostas talked about the restriction on changing gear in Mythic Plus, sort of saying that you won't be able to change your Azerite pieces. So already we were used to the idea in Mythic Plus that you can't change spec. So here you weren't going to be able to change your Azerite pieces. The way they viewed it, and this is where sometimes you get slight contradictions here. I'm not saying it was a bad decision, by the way, but because of the highly specialized nature of Azerite gear, in that it's very much like talents, they said that you shouldn't be able to change it. Of course, later on, they also then said, much more recently, that Azerite gear is nothing to do with talents. It's nothing like talents at all. How times changed. Back in June, it was exactly like talents, and that's why they wanted us to not be able to change it in Mythic Plus at the time, anyway. Artifacts went apeshit ahead of the end of Legion. We had the quest line where we had to sort out the wound in Silithus by pointing our sword at it or whatever else we had. And that magically solved the problem. Going into July, the gold cap was increased for transfers. Quite timely for me, really. From 250k to 1 million. This came at round about the time I had come to the conclusion that I was not going to be able to carry on doing high-end raiding, mythic raiding, or anything like that, because work was going to be too mad. And so, I ended up looking to transfer to a former guild of mine, just to exist as a casual, as a social, casual scrub. The Warbringers Jaina was released, and this focused on regrets for her past decisions. This required, remember, Jaina's personality's changed. She was very pro-peace between Horde and Alliance, through Warcraft 3 and quite a lot of World of Warcraft. She'd allowed her father to be killed, for example, by the Horde. And now, she's very anti-Horde now. A few years ago, they made her very anti-Horde. And after the bombing of Theramore, basically. And so she's now deciding that she regrets that decision. She wishes she hadn't done that. And it's all about, going back to Kul Tiras, her home, where she's not exactly everyone's favourite person. And she's basically going there to face whatever punishment is going to be meted out. The pre-patch scenarios got started as well. And then into August, where it's ramping up. Going into August, we're only like a couple of weeks left from the BFA launch. And there's an awful lot of people going, it's not really ready, is it? I mean, sometimes it's very difficult, like a couple of months out, it's very difficult to know whether it's going to be ready or not, because the state we have it on a beta isn't necessarily the latest build that Blizzard have. It's just what they want us to test. Or, that's, if you're not really familiar with either PTRs or betas or alphas, it doesn't represent their latest working model. It represents what they want us to test. And there are certain things they may not want us to test. So it's always very difficult. But when you're going a couple of weeks in and it's all starting to take shape and you're thinking, this shape, it seems to be a bit of a blob. It's all misshapen. Then it gets worrying and you think to yourself, there's an awful lot of things here that are not going to work. And, people have been saying about certain things that didn't seem quite right for many months. And there seemed to be no progress being made on it. There was an awful lot, just on class design, for example. Remember, they'd gone from a position thinking they didn't need to redesign many of the specs at all to realising that they did. So all of a sudden, they've now got limited time to do that. Did they let their class designers get on with doing that? No, they didn't. They kept throwing other things in, such as the GCD changes, putting quotas on them for uptime, effective or downtime, I suppose is a better way of putting it, in your rotation. Which again, and all these things kept getting tweaked as well. So it wasn't even just that it got thrown in and therefore disrupting the plans of the designers. It kept them being tweaked over the next few months as well, meaning that the designers never had a handle on what their parameters were for designing the classes. So is it then any wonder that many classes were not fit to launch? And they, ahead of launch, quite openly just said, look, there's certain classes, Shadow Priest being chief amongst them, we're not going to get around to getting them ready until like 8.1 at least. They basically just had to abandon some class design. But other than that, not a lot happened in August. Oh, except the expansion launched. It was a global launch. It wasn't too bad actually, but there were some people who were affected and couldn't play through it. Sometimes there were whole realms, I think in the EU, I think Draenor, was it Draenor? Where basically the whole realm couldn't actually really get on. I was able to play for a few hours and then it all went to hell. But it wasn't a disastrous launch. It wasn't terrible. Nothing like WoD. At least it worked. It's sort of okay. And most people, it was fine. But as we'd suspected, a lot of systems were not complete. They weren't really working properly. So, at this point, there was now a bit of a worry that Blizzard, it's like, to what extent do you really know what you're doing? Because remember, we still have in our mind, I think this is disappearing now. We still have in our mind Blizzard as this company that doesn't release something until it's ready. So when you see something that doesn't look ready, you think to yourself, is this actually what they intended? I think we're now getting used to the idea that Blizzard has now changed from that company. It's no longer a company like that. And so, thankfully, it's not as intended. But in September, one nice thing about the start of BFA is that they didn't rush people into the content. This is a bit of an issue they'd had for the last few expansions, where they keep wanting to rush us into it. And Legion, to be fair, they sort of recognised this, and they said as much as well. And they improved it a bit, I think, but I still felt it was a bit too front-loaded, the expansion. BFA was a bit better. You felt eased into it a little bit more. Certainly, if I was still Mythic Raiden, I would have appreciated that quite a lot. And in September, the stuff came out, that the raids and all that sort of business, the competitive stuff came out. There were issues along the way. There were some bugs. and some bugs that persisted for quite a while after being widely catalogued. Some of those were fixed more quickly than others. Some were design issues and not bugs, and then we start to get lots of justifications. We didn't really get frank admissions of failings in design. We got justifications for it. We got defense for it. But the biggest news, really, I think, in September, particularly for those who are interested in the raiding, was that for the first time ever, you could watch someone competing and indeed getting the world first live, because Method decided to stream their all-day progress. The race itself was super tight. It was most unexpected. You know, I don't think people realistically expected Limit to be jostling for that position, but they did, and they were super close as well. They almost did it. So the next race could be very, very interesting indeed. We'll just have to see, and we'll see if there's any other dark horses lurking about as well. Exorcists were not at all happy with their progress. They were completely miffed, so we'll see how they bounce back as well. But it could be very, very interesting. Also be interesting to wonder if Method stream their progress next time as well. Maybe they will. All very strange, because traditionally the competing guilds keep everything secret. They don't publish logs live or anything like that, because they don't want anyone else spying on any cunning plans they have. And then also, even when they have killed it, the rest of us have to wait a while to watch the video to see how they've done it. Traditionally, although this hasn't always been observed, but traditionally there's a bit of an unwritten agreement that a guild that gets world first won't publish that video until the top 5 has been rounded out. But of course this time we could see it because it was streamed live. So that was actually pretty exciting. It was super popular as well. An awful lot of people who kept trying to say before, oh, it's not really relevant, the world first race, it only affects a few people. Completely shot down. Hundreds of thousands of people watching these things. So, you know, at various times. So that idea was blown out of the water. It's an extremely popular piece of content. Just, you know, it's a bit like a sport, isn't it? You can have a knockabout. You can play Sunday League or something like that, or football with your mates of a weekend. Doesn't mean to say that the best teams in the world are irrelevant. Loads of people want to watch them. Who doesn't want to watch the best at a game you enjoy playing? So the launch itself, anyway, towards the end of September, the launch itself was not considered great. And so Ian Hazard-Costas went into what looked like a hastily assembled preview of the 8.1 content. I don't know whether it was. It just seemed less polished a presentation than had normally been the case. And I did wonder if it was just to get the information out there quickly, just to sort of explain to people, look, you know, there's this great stuff coming up, because the launch hadn't been well received. What was announced in terms of the main points of interest, we had the concept of the faction view raid. So a raid that was going to have a slightly different experience for Alliance as compared to Horde. The Dwarf Heritage Armour, the Darkshore Warfront, which also looked like it might be a step up from the earlier one, the like Alterac one. Not Alterac, what am I talking about? Arathi, sorry. Because that's my hope with Warfronts. I mean, Warfronts as they first came out were dull, nothing interesting about them. Even in the beta, it was like, this is dull. And the phrase that was used when they were trying to hype it was, do you remember in Warcraft 1 when you had all those little guys doing all those things for you? Wouldn't it be cool if you could be one of those guys? No. Why would I want to be a peasant? More wood? No. But if, as they evolve, they're putting new systems in place, they're just not ready to go for the first ones, and we end up towards the end of the expansion with a Warfront that's actually quite exciting, then it will have been worth the experiment, even though I always feel you should lead with your best stuff at the start of an expansion, rather than release something in like prototype stage and build on it, because, you know, the start of the expansion is when you're going to have the most people play it. After that, and millions of them will just not. They'll play it at the start and then they'll not. This is just common. And to keep them playing for as long as possible, you need to lead with your best stuff. But, you know, there we go. October was starting to be some very big news coming out. Mike Morheim, all-round nice guy and friendly, player-friendly CEO of Blizzard was elbowed out the way for J. Allen Brack. Much more corporate-minded. And again, an awful lot of people have been laying the blames of Blizzard's direction for a while at the feet of Activision. Whether that's true or not, I don't know. But what I would say is, looking at the situation now, you've got a very different style of leadership at the top. You've got Blizzard now behaving in a way that an awful lot of game studios are behaving. And an awful lot of game studios got a bit of a rude awakening this year. Whether they'll learn from it's another matter. In copying an awful lot of flack for their games. Because ultimately, they're not treating their players with respect. Their customers with respect. And this has been the case for a number of game studios. And Blizzard now are amongst them. But, that's for the next month. Blizzard also moved from trying to justify all the design features that people were not at all in favour of, to first of all doing more feedback type stuff, and they did it already, AMA and all that business, to finally turning around and going, oh yeah, we totally agree with all those things you've got an issue with. Whereas a few weeks before they were defending it to the hilt. Oh no, yeah, we totally agree. We just don't really know what to do about it. And then slowly by the end of the month they were going, right, here's what we're going to do about some of those things. So that all sounded pretty good. Unfortunately knee-jerk, so it wasn't all really well thought out, but never mind. At least, we started to see, okay, you're finally listening now, and you are making some improvements. These improvements sound really good. So there's a bit of positivity there. Then into November and BlizzCon. By this time, everyone could see stocks in Activision Blizzard sort of really plummeting. A lot of people sort of put a lot of emphasis on what happened at BlizzCon, which is nonsense because that's not the trigger for it. And also World of Warcraft, which again is a smaller part of their overall portfolio. This was clearly a Call of Duty issue. But anyway, obviously at BlizzCon, we had the Q&A, which was very sanitized. It's become increasingly sanitized, where you stand at a podium. Everyone had to put their questions in advance, and then they'll print it on a card for you, and you read out the card. No ad libbing, although for some reason Chris Metzen got away with a bit of an ad lib, and they will answer them in their generic way by basically telling you almost nothing. That's not to say that there wasn't anything of interest there, but But then I suppose, who could blame them for wanting to stage manage very carefully these interactions with the audience after the disaster that the Diablo stage put on? Yeah. We got to find out some information about 8.2, which for my mind is where the expansion really starts. It's quite funny. A lot of people saying with the release of patch 8.1, oh, this is when BFA is really launched, because it's only now that people feel it's in the state that it should have launched. But in my mind, 8.2 is the start of the expansion, which sounds a bit weird. But the reason for that is the title of the expansion is Battle for Azeroth. Everyone keeps talking about it being this Alliance versus Horde thing. But then that doesn't make sense with the title of the expansion. And the only thing that makes sense is the war against the old gods. And that looks like it begins in 8.2. We found out, we knew that we were going to be tackling Ashara. We just didn't know when. We now found out that it's going to be in the 8.2 raid. We're also going to get a couple of new zones, one of which is a gnome zone for some reason. But hopefully, rather than being full of the actual annoying gnomes, it'll be mostly the mechanical gnomes, the proper gnomes. They're fine. I have no issue with those. But we will have to see. In theory, the idea of a whole zone full of gnomes is my idea of hell. But as a casual player, I suppose I'll be able to miss a lot of it out, I hope. The 14th anniversary of World of Warcraft was also in November, where we got the Corgi goggles. The best thing ever in any MMO. The best item, in fact, in any computer-based role-playing game I've ever had. I kid you not, I tweeted them to say, this is the best thing ever. And then they nerfed it almost immediately. Who the hell nerfs Corgi goggles? This just confirmed the fun sponge department is a thing at Blizzard. Who nerfs Corgi goggles? What What overpowered abuse was someone putting it to that required that? Anyway, the new forums came out as well. The sort of, they started off towards the beginning of the year with changing the MVP program, and then they changed the forum so you couldn't do things like downvote, which is very negative in my view. Not downvoting is negative. I think the ability to take it away is, because the problem is if someone disagrees with a post or doesn't like it, whatever, they can downvote it. That's fine. When you remove that, you're trying to create the idea that, posts are not disagreed with. It's just some people agree with them more than others with the upvotes. But in fact, what you do is by removing someone's ability to object in a very minor way, you force them to object in a more strongly worded way, which of course increases the chances of some unpleasant comments being put in there. Now, of course, they're not going to stay there because it's heavily moderated, but So there were some good features of the new forums. There are some good features of them, but also some features. A lot of people sort of feeling this is a way of managing discussions there and therefore rendering them useless. And so the forums that exist elsewhere, Wowhead, MMO Champion, and they're going to remain much more relevant. And then into December, we had patch 8.1 go live. As I say, the point at which people felt, yep, this is how it should have launched. This is okay now. Not necessarily amazing. Still some issues, but actually this would have been acceptable as a launch. So they're considering that this was the date when BFA really launched. You got the new part of the quest line, which was supposed to be choose your allegiance, Sylvanas or Sourfang, but in reality was just, do you want a toy or not? Ironic being at December as well, the time when presents are used to bribe people to choose a particular thing, make a decision. Do you want a toy or do you not want a toy? I want a toy. Oh, so you're a fan of Sourfang, are you? Well done. So yeah, and that's where we've ended it. So I would say, from my personal point of view, I would say that it started off with some promise, frank acknowledgement of Legion was not a bad expansion by any means. It was a very good one on balance. But there was some frank admission of things that hadn't gone ideally. And I wondered at the time, is this them, I had hope. I thought, is this them just doing what they usually do, acknowledging the things they're going to change anyway to make it look like they're listening and wanting to improve it, but then just pay lip service to it and ignore it completely? Or are they actually serious about this? Turned out it was the former. And I would say World of Warcraft has had a rough year. It's had a very rough year. There was reputed to be at some point around about October a massive drop in subs. We can't get confirmation of this, but many indications would back it up. But it is hearsay. And that being the case, obviously World of Warcraft still has a future. At the subs it's reputed to have, it still makes it the king of MMOs. And that's the thing to remember. World of Warcraft scaled heights that were not realistic for an MMO. Not at all realistic. It was a bubble, and the bubble at some point has to burst. Not that it's burst, it's just deflating. But it deflated at a hell of a rate a couple of months ago. And I don't think it's not ended the year at the worst point. It's not a constant decline. It has picked up a bit. But I think it's ended the year in a far worse state than it started it. 2019 will not be a lead-in year, of course. It will be one where there'll be lots of BFA content coming out. So we'll have to see if they also decide to reevaluate the way they think about design decisions, not just getting things ready. But time will tell on that. But there is, I think, more hope for that. Not only, as I say, are we going to get more regular content, and that means more regular advancement of the story, which is, with a few criticisms, not a bad story. The BFA story is not at all bad. It's fairly engaging. So, that I'm looking forward to that. But what I'm most looking forward to in 2019, it's not Classic WoW. I will be playing that. A lot of people are looking forward to Classic WoW. What I'm most looking forward to, I have to say, in 2019, is to see what happens with design decisions. Am I going to see any shift, any change in their approach? because that's what's going to give me some confidence for the future. And it could take the full year. So next year, I think I'll reevaluate that and see where they are. But anyway, that's my review of 2018 for World of Warcraft. Let me know what your highs and lows were in the comments below. If you've enjoyed the video, please don't forget to click the like button, subscribe for further content. Click the bell notification if you want to be notified of that content. Until next time, I'll see you later and have a great new year.